I want to welcome everybody to this session in Peace Week, in which we're going to be talking about developments in our field that create jobs and what kinds of job opportunities are available for people in conflict resolution and peace studies. I'm Richard Rubenstein. I am a professor emeritus from the Carter School. I started teaching at the Carter School in 1987 and stopped teaching full-time last year. And if I'm retired, why am I so busy? Is the question I keep asking myself. At any rate, I'm chairing the school's advisory board, and the advisory board for the Carter School is a number of people, mainly from the DMV area, although some of them are outside the area, who are friends of the school and interested in supporting it, interested in relating to students and faculty, a very important bunch of people who helped us conceive of and promote and produce this particular session. I'm absolutely delighted that we're doing it in Peace Week because it tells you, to begin with, a lot about what our hopes and dreams have been at the Carter School. And then I want to mention two things in particular. One is that the Carter School and the field of peace studies and conflict resolution really come into existence at about the same time. And so we have had the exciting job of not only helping to prepare people to practice conflict resolution and peace building, but also to help create a field. It would take me too long to give you a history of the field. I'm not going to do that, but I will say that it's been really a thrill to be in essence on the ground floor of the development of this field, and to see what is now something like 1,500 graduates, maybe more, take their place in society and doing in a way in which demonstrates their determination to change the way societies operate, so that the causes of deep-rooted violence are mitigated or eliminated. Our field has always been, in that sense, a missionary operation. But I remember very early when we had the first welcoming dinner for students at the school, and I was asked to speak. I said to the students that we are somewhere between an academic department and a church or a religious organization, because we're strongly dedicated to the truth, to finding out, in particular, finding out what really drives conflicts and what can be done to resolve them peacefully. But we're also absolutely determined to make this world less violent and more just. So the question then is, how do you do that and run an operation in which people get trained to do jobs, and people can get get out into what we would, along with some of our religious friends, we might describe in some ways as a fallen world, and live in it and make a living in it, right? Do some good and raise a family and survive. So that challenge, which has always been a challenge for us, but I think is one in which, in some ways, we have met successfully. At any rate, in order to meet it successfully, we have to keep an eye on what's happening in the world and in the field, that produces opportunities for people to do good and do well at the same time. And so that's why we have asked some alumni and friends of the school to talk to you, people who know a lot about both the field and the jobs in the field, to talk to you for a while this morning. We're going to keep our remarks short so as to leave time for discussion. And so I'm absolutely delighted to have these folks here this morning. The people we're going to be talking to are Brian Polkinghorn, Peter Swanson, Michael Shank, and Paul Turner. And I'll introduce each of them very briefly before they speak, but let me start with Brian, an alum who is now a distinguished professor of conflict analysis and dispute resolution at Salisbury University in Maryland, and also executive director of the Bosserman Center for Conflict Resolution, and one of the most knowledgeable people I know about what's happening in the field and what opportunities may exist for students and alumni in the field. So Brian, it's great to have you here as always. Brian is also a member of our advisory board. And let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Rich. I appreciate that very much. I also want to mention, can you hear me okay? I have a very directionalized, okay. My microphone sometimes plays tricks on me. I want to point out there's somebody online with us right now, Brittany Fouts. She's down at Kennesaw State University. And Brittany was an undergraduate here and ran off to the real world and then came back and got her master's and ran off to Kennesaw and got her PhD and then came back on a fellowship as a visiting professor for 5 or 6 years, and then she's back there. But she's been working with me for 10 of the last years on a project I began in 1995 looking at the field. And frankly, Rich, the reason I did this is because I was sick and tired of going to conferences and meetings and people just kind of guessing as to what was going on. And I knew it was going to be a little bit of a trick to start building up the knowledge base to know how the practice real world meshes with the academic world. And we've managed to, in our research in these databases, nail down more than 1,500 universities around the world that offer grad credentials in our field. 1,200 universities and colleges with 1,500 credentials. And then on the practice side, I want to show you some slides that we cooked up for this talk, just to give you an idea of how incredibly expansive the field has got. It is growing. And if people are thinking about the traditional lanes of entree, they're very much limiting not only their opportunities, but the development of the field. So I'm gonna share my screen and briefly run through some slides. Can you guys see a slide deck that says Bosserman Center?
Yes.
Okay. And okay, so I'm just going to go through some slides real quick just to give you an idea of what people are doing and what's going on out there. And if we just use this first slide as a means of just looking at skills-based opportunities going from left to right, we only chose one. In it is, if you look in the green, it says conflict and then mediation. We said, let's look at the practitioners in one of our databases. And so we have a private practitioner. So this is the private sector of individuals who are in our field that have joined like American Academy of Family Mediators or Mediators Beyond Borders or any host of our organizations, or they work for courts or they get their work through different parts of society and whatnot. And just looking at these rough, almost 7,000 practitioners in the database right now, we want to let you know that the overwhelming majority of people practice mediation. It's like the crown jewel of interest-based third-party intervention. But you can see there's a whole bunch of other types of practice people do. It's just so telling. Now, if you break it down by attorney practitioners versus, say, non-attorney practitioners, things begin to change around a little bit, and you have folks that are practicing in multiple areas. The point is this. if you can see this slide, it should make no sense. It's just be so jammed up, you should be irritated going, Brian, why show this slide? It's actually a slide that's been compressed by about 3 or 4 feet. Because what this does is it shows where these people are practicing. And there's about 440 areas of practice, ranging from absenteeism to zippers, to manufacturing zippers. I know that sounds kind of funny and whatnot, but if you look at these spikes in these troughs and whatnot, that's what's telling. And what Brittany's done is she took the top of those spikes to show you substantively, this is the important thing, like what's going on in the field, where are people working? And some of it's stereotypical hit and run. Yeah, I know that. And others should be a little bit of a surprise. But if you look at those 7,000 mediators and where they're doing most of their practice, the bulk of them fall into these categories, anywhere from 2,000 people reporting down to 500. And from right to left, that all makes sense. There's a couple things in there like personal injury, and that's the attorney practitioner that's doing these sorts of mediations. Now, I want to move on real quickly. That's just to give you a quick idea that mediation still dominates third-party intervention, and I want people to think differently about the field because the field is thinking differently. They don't necessarily want mediation when it comes to, say, NGOs and other organizations. So here's a list of 725 NGOs that we have, and they're in our field. They have names like Focus Humanitarian Assistance or Peace Brigades International, the usual players. Fund for Peace, Search for Common Ground. And what we did is we've gone in and looked at what they're doing and what they say in their mission statements to get an idea of where they fall into what baskets. And it's interesting that the international non-government organizations are heavily loaded towards anything dealing with peace, building peace development, human rights, that kind of thing. And so when you're thinking about what's going on in the field, how do I get into it? And you know what your skill set is, and you know where the substantive expertise is, and where the focus of all the energy is, you're going to do yourself a heck of a lot better of an idea. And this is just, guys, trust me when I say this, there are tens of thousands of INGOs. It's staggering. If you look at some of the guys who've been at this for 30, 40 years, they have databases of 15, 20,000, 25,000 NGOs. One of the things we all wanted to ask them too is like, hey, do you guys practice what you preach? Do you do the same things we're doing? And interestingly enough, INGOs don't spend much time at all on training in our field, but when they do, so roughly 2/3 of the INGOs in our database, they're not interested in that. They're actually putting on their hip waders out in the swamp, saving lives, doing things out in the field, getting dirty, getting real work done. But if you do look at those who provide the training, this is really telling. It's almost interest-based, face-to-face focused stuff, facilitation, mediation, that kind of things. The stuff that's very well known to our field. So that's a good thing. It's like, okay, practice-wise and process-wise. Can you guys hear my dog lapping up water in the background? Sorry, this is very distracting. But you look at what we're teaching in the field, it's matching this up fairly well. Now, I want to show you something, and I need to explain this. And Rich, I'm pretty close to being done. We wanted to look at think tanks because if you look at the future of future studies, disaster studies, trend analysis, predictive analysis, scenario building, all those sorts of tools we have analytically, which we do not spend enough time teaching or emphasizing to our students. If you look at those things and say, hey, let's look at the field, let's look at these fence posts, what's going on 1, 2, 3 horizons over. Think tanks are a window into some of the things that are going on. Now, this is a Gephi output run. It looks like a piece of artwork. Now, I've got the program, and when you hover over these hubs and nodes, it emphasizes something like economics, development, security, policy, environment, education. And then those little lines, if you hover over the lines, it shows you from hub to hub and spoke to spoke who's doing what. So if I wanted to click on, say, energy security or water security, food security, which is one of these hubs, it'll light up. And then I can go to them and I know who's doing what. I love these programs, and I'm a real Luddite. I'm super slow on this stuff. So to make it easy, I said, Brittany, can you dumb this down for me? and this is another depiction of a Gephi run. and looking at these several hundred think tanks, of which, by the way, the top 100 think tanks in the world are always represented in this database, and it changes every year. And a professor at the University of Pennsylvania puts this together, and it's based on revenue and grants and contracts and endowments and what are their social media hits, what type of publications what do they produce, and who's taking it, who's ingesting this knowledge and whatnot. They're in there, and the top think tanks in the field of conflict resolution are in there as well, peace and conflict resolution. So the bigger the circle, the more people are playing that game. So you can see economics is huge in think tanks, as is energy and environment and policy and climate change. I know Michael's into that sorts of stuff. Trade and defense and whatnot. Now, as you get into the smaller ones, it gets super, super specific. And the reason I want people to know this is there's just a ton of stuff going on. So I'm going to do one more slide. And this is an homage to Pete Swanson. And this is the federal programs. So when you start looking at what's going on in the field, you get a little nutsy cuckoo, like, oh my gosh, what direction do I go? This is 360 degrees fourfold. So the federal programs, there's about 350 programs in there, and Pete Swanson's with the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, the crown jewel. This is the feds, the only place where somebody can call themselves a federal mediator. And they have a storied history, and over the years, it's grown and grown and grown. So you look at this federal programs and you say, well, what are they doing? And what we did is we categorize them by action. Are they internally focused? Is this like workplace conflict resolution stuff? Is it externally focused, like public policy dialogues and facilitations and dealing with angry public? Is it a little bit of both? And so with EPA, you got maybe more of a little bit of an outside focus, and then with NIH, it's more of an inside focus. And then you start saying, okay, let's break these guys up by internally versus externally focused, and what are they doing? What are they offering? What skills base do we as a field, academic field, provide them? And if you look at this, you realize, wow, 2/3 of what they're doing is mediation and facilitation stuff. The internally focused are dominated by interest-based problem solving, face-to-face. Hey, let's sit down and work this out kind of stuff, which makes perfect sense, but it reinforces what we need to be teaching and what they're asking for, and it's growing. If you look at just state programs, we only have about 800 programs and departments in the state levels, and I know there's a lot more. But by looking just at the feds, which is sort of a closed shop, you can see these distinctions. Now, if you're more of a little bit of a rights-based person, you got a legal training or whatever, you can look at the external programs and you see it change right away. There's only about half of it's interest-based. Then you've got things like fact-finding, mini trials, arbitration, which makes sense. But by providing this data, by going out and doing this research, we're able to show students and people what's going on in the field so that you can then build your strategy. This last 2 slides, and I'll be very quick.
You have to be. You're almost out of time, Brian. So
okay, so I want people to look at the field in themselves and say, what's my toolbox? What's my knowledge, skills, and ability? And package it, mix and match what we do based on what's going on out there. But more importantly, 2 things. We're de-emphasizing or not giving enough attention to the conflict analysis part of the field. And there's a ton of work there. It's little utilized. There's a hell of a lot of need. You can make a living doing this conflict analysis work much better. Look, do a little bit of analytical work, and it's equivalent to 2-3 years of facilitation and mediation work. Last thing is there's these opportunities in the young folks that are in our field. The entrepreneurial folks are the ones that are also creating opportunities, and that's what I really want to emphasize. And then finally, I just want to point out this middle one, developing relationships. I would say that the people who've been in the field the longest are the ones you need to talk to. They've seen what's happened, what's going on now, and how that's going to impact the future. You can forecast all you want, but people who've been around the block are the ones who are going to be able to tell you with a little bit more certainty what's probable versus what's possible. Okay, that's it. I just wanted to start off with that so that to give an idea that there's a ton of stuff going on out there, and it's super hard to just wrap your head around it. But that's the good news.
That's terrific. That's terrific. When are you going to make this information public at some point?
Yes. Brittany and I'm on sabbatical. We're cranking on this, and it's coming out in the book. Yes.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you very much. And let me just say to all the folks out there that we are going to have time to talk about all this. We're going to limit our remarks, just as Brian did, and we'll have time to talk about this as soon as everybody's finished talking. So let me go then to Pete Swanson, who Brian mentioned, an early graduate and a very successful, tremendously successful graduate of our program, who is director of the Office of Conflict Management and Prevention at the FMCS, the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. I need to say that the first time I learned about FMCS was from Jim Lowy. Jim Lowy, our late great colleague, who worked there and was assigned, while working there, was assigned to work with Dr. Martin Luther King. So Jim, some of you may know, Jim was actually the first person to King's side when he was shot in 1968. And Jim taught us about the possibility of working within the federal government, which at that point a lot of us viewed as as an enemy. Jim taught us about the possibility of doing good by working with the government. So Pete has continued in that tradition, and it's wonderful to have him here. He is far away from us today. Pete is, I don't know, where are you, Pete? In Kosovo or someplace? He's out in the field. He happily told us, I don't even know what time it is there for you, but I'm happy you could do this. And let me turn it over to you now, Pete Swanson.
Hey, thank you, Rich. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, very well.
Okay. I had to move from the computer over to the phone. Thank you for that introduction. And Brian, thank you. I always love your research, and hello to everybody out there and on the panel. I appreciate being on this. I'm excited to talk with you all. I'm going to make my remarks really short, Rich. I want to preface this. I want to speak to those who are interested in working in the field, and I'm coming at it from having two different lenses. The first is that I have been with federal mediation now nearly a total of 18 years, but that's been in two bites. I was with them for 12 years after I graduated from the George Mason program, and then I had nearly my own practice for nearly 20 years. And they asked me to come back and to lead this department. So I've been doing that for nearly 6 years. So it's quite a view of how one actually makes a living in this field. And so what I want to share with you who are interested in working, and I'd be curious what the panel thinks, whether this resonates. It seems to resonate with some of Brian's research, but what I have certainly seen, because I personally trained thousands and thousands of mediators all over the world, and what I can tell you is they don't make a living at it full time. It just doesn't happen. There are a few, and most of those who do, who want to specialize in that, either work for some type of public sector, whether it's a state or a federal agency that's devoted to some kind of mediation or conflict resolution. And there are certainly in other countries, they have those as well. And then there are those who may be affiliated with court-referred programs, who are generally attorneys who have a steady supply of cases coming from contacts and relationships that they may have in the courts. But that's not a huge number of people. I've also found out, and I want to clearly tell this to people, that conflict doesn't pay. People don't pay for a service or acknowledging generally of conflict. They'll pay attorneys to deal with it, but they generally don't want to pay for mediation or other types of third party services because they don't really like to admit that they're in it. Now, of course, there's lots of money in a developmental field, like the project I'm working on now here in Kosovo, sure, but not everybody can work in that kind of arena. What I will tell you is that while people don't pay for conflict, what they do pay for is connection. And that's really important to understand, because they yearn and they pay for that. They want to make themselves work better. They want to get over issues where they're out of alignment. They want to qualitatively be better in leading their organizations and creating harmonious, workable spaces, communities. So we have to rethink a lot of how we frame what we do, from conflict to connection. That's one thing that I would certainly put out there. And what I have seen are the most successful people who work in this field are those who don't come in and call themselves the mediators. Brian said that's not always an acceptable term, and we have many conflicts. I'm sorry, customers of ours who will want our services, but they'll say, "Hey, please don't call it mediation. That's a bad term here. It's not something that we resonate with, and that our workforce doesn't particularly like, or our constituency doesn't like." So the idea of reframing uh, who we are and what we do, and bringing in the whole skill sets of conflict resolution, conflict prevention, and associated skill sets around leadership development, culture change, coaching, executive coaching, change management. These are things that people pay for. And what they do is they seek out those people who help them in whatever position they're in, who can bring these skills into the current positions that they're in. They become the go-to people, and they don't frame themselves or sell themselves as facilitator or mediator or arbitrator or something that's generally connected with our field. They could be a program manager. They could occupy any position within a company. It's the skill set that they bring in that relates to our field that they become known as the go-to people, because the experience that we sell is what sells and what provides for our continued growth and expansion. I think when you're really thinking of how do you try to navigate and make a living in this field. I'm saying that from a practitioner's point of view. I'll stop there, Rich. I could go on.
Oh, good. Well, thank you so much, Pete. I know people are going to want to ask you questions about your own work and related issues and what you just said. But thanks very much for those really interesting remarks. So let us go now to another graduate of our program, a doctoral graduate, Michael Shank, who has been Director of Engagement for the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance. Michael, it's important, I think, for you to hear from Michael for a lot of reasons. For one thing, he always has something interesting to say. But it's important also because what you've already been hearing from Brian and Peter is that the kind of third-party work, which our field was very strongly identified with when it started, and which is still a very important part of the field for many people, is clearly not it's clearly no longer an adequate way of describing the field or the opportunities. Third-party work, the notion that there are people in conflict and you somehow get between them and help them work out their differences is one way to deal with conflict, still an important way, but there are other ways as well. And Michael is one of the people who has been doing some of those other ways ever since he graduated at a very high level and very effectively. So let me turn it over to you, Michael, and let's very interested in what you have to say.
Thanks, Rich, and thanks for organizing this. Great to be with everyone for this conversation about this conflict 2.0 in terms of how we engage the world and how we employ our graduates and how we intersect with all the things which have been mentioned by previous speakers already. I'm going to attend to 5 Ds, D as in dog, very quickly, things I thought about in prep for this talk. So I work in the climate space. I've been working in the climate space for many years, and as Rich noted, specifically with cities as they're decarbonizing. So my first D is for decarbonization, because as we know, climate, and as Brian's already mentioned, climate change is causing conflict and insecurity around the world. We know this, whether it's resource scarcity or water scarcity or food insecurity, et cetera. We are seeing climate change create conflict increasingly in and on every continent. So our work as conflict preventers, managers, transformers, is needed in the climate space more and more. And this is something I've pushed Carter School to lean on and lead in. And Rich, of course, has supported this thinking as well. And I'm sure I'm speaking to the choir here, where the Carter School can and should lead in this space in terms of conflict that's related to climate, climate security, climate conflict, environmental peace building in the biggest sense of the word. So I'll just start with that first D being decarbonization, because we need more conflict-trained types in the climate space, without a doubt. And that's someone who's been in the climate space for a long time. So we need conflict resolvers in our field now more than ever. And we need the Carter School to lead in this space. The remaining Ds are perhaps newer to some folks as I'm trying to build a bridge between my climate community and my conflict community and training. So these Ds aren't new ideas to you, but this is just me noticing some bridge building between the conflict space and the climate space. The second D has to do with DEI. So diversity, equity, inclusion work, as we know, is both being scaled up and shot down, depending on which party you're speaking to. But in the climate space, you're seeing cities around the world lean into and lead on diversity, equity, inclusion work. And what that needs is a whole bunch of folks trained in the sociological frameworks that the Carter School is leading on. And so as cities lean into work around equity, inclusion, and a more inclusive community engagement strategy for the climate work, we need folks trained from the Carter School in that space, helping cities do that, or national governments do that, or state governments do that, regional governments, provincial governments. My work as director of engagement has definitely benefited from my training at the Carter School. And so as I help cities do engagement better and create more inclusive engagement strategies in and around climate policy, it's 100% advantaged by the fact that I was trained at the Carter School, but that does mean we need more Carter School conflict trained sociologist types helping governments do the DEI work as in the best possible way, but the most inclusive way possible. And with that conflict framing, it just enables you to advise a government, and in my case, city governments, in a better deployment of those strategies. Third D is around de-escalation. And I've been talking with some of my cities, and they've been telling me that they're leading in this language. So I'm not choosing de-escalation. They're telling me that they're thinking a lot about de-escalation. What I mean by that, especially in the US, but increasingly in Europe, you're seeing climate become solely a partisan issue. So in the United States, climate policy is primarily now a Democratic issue. Didn't used to be that way. Republicans used to lead more in the conservation space, preservation space, and even climate space. But now it's really a political issue. And so some cities are seeing, both in the US and in Europe, climate policy being targeted for evisceration and defunding. And instead, public safety priorities are the priority of the city council or the mayor, and environmental budgets, climate budgets are being cut. That is a problem. And so some of our sustainability leaders, some of our climate leaders are thinking about how do we de-escalate this conversation, make it a little less political, more apolitical. And that work is new for them. And that work is where conflict-trained sociologist types from the Carter School can help inform that de-escalatory process so that we can get the good work done, but reduce some of the noise that surrounds it. Because as you can imagine, those of you in the US context are seeing it, but also in the European context, as the far right gets more seats in parliaments across Europe. So that de-escalatory process that cities are having to do so that they can save their climate budgets, really important for Carter-trained conflict experts to advise. Fourth D is around distrust, and that's less government, more social, but we're seeing rising levels of distrust. And so our cities are being forced to think about rebuilding trust in their climate work. And they weren't trained in that, but as they think about rolling out resilience hubs, for example, in the US, but increasingly in Europe, to provide power, heat, AC, food, clean water when the grids go down or when extreme weather destroys power systems or water systems, and they go to these resilience hubs for physical resilience, how do we simultaneously use these spaces that are being funded by the sustainability departments, that are being funded by the resilience departments, that are being funded by the climate departments, to also rebuild social cohesion, social capital, communities, et cetera. So I'm asking our cities to really think about mending some of that distrust by creating programming that rebuilds trust in communities while simultaneously doing climate work. Now, again, that's new for a lot of climate staff, sustainability staff, environmental staff. They weren't trained in conflict frameworks. They weren't trained as sociologists. They were probably trained in public planning, urban design, environmental science, et cetera. And now they're having to face rising levels of distrust, not only within a community, but between the community and the government. And so that distrust, addressing that distrust needs our help. And so we can advise that process too. And then my 5th D is around something I'm pushing cities to think about, which is de-siloing their work across departments so that we're burying and embedding our work in socioeconomic focused departments so that our environmental work, our climate work, our sustainability work is actually rerouting through housing, it's rerouting through health, it's rerouting through economic development. And the sinews that we're asking for to be created in that de-siloing process is something I think only sociologists can best figure out, because I even proposed in Stockholm when I was with my cities 2 weeks ago for our annual meeting that perhaps a city government of the future doesn't even have an environmental department, because we've done such an effective job of embedding the climate work, the environmental work in the socioeconomic focused departments of a city as a way of both protecting the climate work, because it's a target right now, both in US and Europe, less so in some of our cities in Australia. But as the far right rises, how do we de-silo in a way to both protect climate work going forward, but importantly, lean into, and this is the last part of my 5th D here, intersectionality, which is a word, of course, everyone's familiar with. But as we serve society, it does not help us to be so siloed in our city governments or our national governments. And so to be truly intersectional, to really serve, not only to dismantle and undo systems of oppression in an intersectional way, but also to serve society in an intersectional way so that we're simultaneously addressing socioeconomic and environmental needs of a community. That can only be done, in my mind, if we intentionally de-silo the way in which government agencies are set up. So that's something our cities are thinking about, and requires that informed hand of a conflict practitioner who can help that work move forward, especially when you're working with planners and public policy types who maybe didn't have that training. So those are the 5 Ds that I'm thinking about, and I'll just reiterate them again. So decarbonization, we need conflict practitioners in the decarb space, because we know climate is causing conflict around the world. And this is something I want Carter to lean on and lead in. And there's a lot of C's in this space, so it's a good tongue twister from conflict and climate to decarb. DEI, obviously in the diversity, equity, inclusion space, helping cities and governments, national governments to do inclusive community engagement more effectively. That needs a conflict practitioner's hand. De-escalation, because it's become so political. Distrust, how do we ensure that all our climate programming is simultaneously rebuilding social cohesion, social capital, and trust. And then lastly, de-siloing government agencies and departments so that we can really be intersectional in our approach, and that too needs a conflict practitioner's hand. So I'll stop there. Those are some of the 5 Ds I was thinking about in prep for this conversation. Thanks, Rich.
Michael, wonderful. Thank you very much. Michael does not blow his own horn, so I have to say, because he didn't, that he has been working in policy-related conflict resolution, but very often involving changing systems that are producing conflict, so they stop producing conflict. From the time he graduated, and he was a legislative assistant to an important congressperson who worked in Congress for several years. He represented the American Friends Service Committee and Foreign Affairs before Congress. And so if you want to talk about policy issues and conflict resolution in that context, in a systemic context, Michael's a guy to talk to, and we'll give you a chance to do that when everybody's finished. When our last speaker, though, I'm really happy to welcome, is a new friend, Paul Turner, who is the president and executive director of an outfit that many of you may know about already, called the Fund for Peace in DC. The Fund for Peace, I'm going to not say anything much about it now, but I'm going to leave that to Paul. The Fund for Peace is a very important NGO And I does very, very serious work in lots of fields and subfields. So I'm very happy to have Paul here. I think we're going to find out about aspects of our field that you may not have known about before from him. So Paul, delighted to have you here. You take it away.
Thanks so much, and it's an honor to be speaking with you all and to learn a little bit from some of my fellow panelists too. I want to share a couple of hard truths, but hopefully leave you with a silver lining. So to start off with some of the tougher things to swallow, there's some really scary trends going on right now. So we've got violence increasing in levels that we've not seen for several decades, because we've had some time where there were some fairly positive trends, maybe with some blips here and there, but that seems to have reversed. And whether that's taking place kind of at the local level or whether we're seeing that manifesting through wars, that seems to be fairly commonplace now in ways that aren't capturing the imagination of the public, and being at the tip of the tongues of our national and international leaders, which I find to be really disturbing. The other part of that I find to be even scarier is after I think the field had grown, and really started to establish itself, not just academically, but in the policy and practice space. Funding has taken a fairly notable downturn, and I can see that whether we're looking at governments, whether we're looking at the role of foundations or some of the development finance institutions, et cetera. There's a little bit of positive element there to link back to what we just heard in the discussion around the 5Ds, and that some of the peace and conflict work is being more cross-cutting now as opposed to siloed off. And so that's a positive element there. And so all of the funding hasn't completely disappeared at all. There's still plenty out there that's both specific, and then we also see peace and conflict issues surfacing in a lot of kind of supporting roles of other initiatives. I find this to be really perplexing because it's at a time when we're learning more and more. The evidence behind our field has grown by leaps and bounds, and I expect it will continue to do so with the advent of technologies. And I don't understand why, when we've got more information about the savings that can be made, whether that's financial or in lives, through preventative efforts, we still see that downward turn, but it's happening. However, there is a demand for just kind of this nonstop desire to consume data and an increasing demand for analysis. I think I just met with a former colleague, quasi-mentor, whose name is Rob Jenkins, that used to work at USAID and oversee a lot of their conflict work there. He's just recently left to join the Wilson Center, and he feels like the big gap in the field is how can we make the case and build up advocacy for these efforts. So hopefully his work will be successful, and there'll be a lot more opportunities in the future than we see right now. So there are a couple of things that I wanted to focus on in terms of changes in the field. One is you've got a handful of old guys here talking to you about what they've seen, and a mention of DEI. And one of the ways that that's manifesting within the U.S. government and also initiatives within the UN and other major donors is that we're seeing this push towards supporting locals. When I first started, and a couple of decades ago, there were a lot of international people on most project staff, and as it should be, those numbers are dwindling significantly. That doesn't mean that all the funding is going to locals necessarily. And I think that's why the US and others have decided to really try and prioritize this. It's gotten lip service for 10 or 15 years, but we're seeing big changes. And so what does that mean for us that might be Americans or from other parts of the world? It means that we need to be able to step back and figure out how we pivot. And what that looks like is we go into more of a supporting role instead of trying to take the limelight. So we're there to build capacity, to offer technical assistance, to serve as sounding boards, to kind of facilitate and catalyze networks, those types of things, where we're really looking for this idea that practice and research has reinforced over and over that the best solutions are coming from local voices, local leaders, local ideas most of the time. And that, I think, is a really positive trend, and hopefully we'll continue to see funding go more and more toward local organizations. And I'm going to be fairly quick through my comments in the hopes that allows for more exploration and questions. But the other thing that I wanted to touch on quickly is a space that my organization's also working in. So as a peace building organization, we've been working with local partners for decades, and we've also have been in this space that's emerging just the last couple of years, which is kind of the evolution of alphabet soup from CSR to ESG to what now they're talking about as PII. And so what is all this stuff? It's an idea that corporations have some form of an obligation to engage and not just be rapacious in their business operations. And PII stands for Peace Impact Investing. And so it's looking at the broader system, not just at a company doing business, but where the investors are coming from, what the community is that they're working in, and how they can move beyond looking at business simply as return on investment, but trying to find ways where you can start to generate peace outcomes in the work that they're doing. It's still, I think, a bit theoretical in practice, but we are working with the African Development Bank in building out a guidebook as to how they can increase their efficiency and effectiveness, with the idea that they would like to see more peace outcomes in their very traditional investments. So if they are setting up a water plant or building a road or whatever the case might be, what are the considerations they need to be going through to try and move beyond kind of that conflict sensitive development lens, which a lot of the big players have been able to apply for quite some time, and really start to push for peace outcomes. We've been focusing in the Sahel, and that is kind of like a proof of concept, and we're getting ready to have a pilot project with them to see if we can really bring as much rigor as possible into that guidebook, because it's hard to offer a lot of guidance that doesn't get to the level of it being so vague it's not helpful, but it can be applied everywhere. And so it's a unique series of exchanges that have been going back and forth between us and our counterparts at the African Development Bank. Another thing that I think is maybe even more exciting, because the mission is really different at heart, is that we've been working with Chevron in the Niger Delta to really explore this idea of peace impact investing. And so in partnership with a local organization that's getting at that whole localization idea and initiative, this local group called PIND, and we've been working to try and figure out what does this mean and what does this look like. So they've been doing studies to try and figure out, what are fields that are ripe for investment in the Delta, and came up with renewable energy and agribusiness, and have been talking with potential investors that are really intrigued by this idea of not just being able to make money, but being able to do some good along the way. A little bit hesitant because they obviously don't want to see their money disappear either, and the Niger Delta is not the most stable and likely place you might think if you're looking to put money into some agribusiness initiative. And so we've been working with them to try and really understand what might take place and what that would look like, again, to try and move beyond how can we just avoid doing harm, to actually shifting that and doing good. And having that not just be lip service, but having that be a core component of the design of our work. And we've had other partners come in with some of the intellectual framing. There's an office that's with an organization called Peace in Switzerland called Finance for Peace. They may spin out and become a new organization this next year that's been really trying to create some of the standards of how this field might come into being. And Chevron, I think, is both cautious and excited because they see this as a way of really being able to take their ESG initiatives or their CSR initiatives, for those of you that might be a little bit older, and find ways to put those on steroids, and also to where Chevron's not going to have to bear the burden of so much of that community engagement in the future. Because if they're able to bring other industries in and able to have those engaged in the communities, really trying to generate positive outcomes, then I think that there's a lot of promise there. So why is all that positive? Because we're seeing all of the traditional donors really start to tighten the purse strings a little bit when it looks to funding that's going toward peace and conflict. And so if we can look to the private sector and make a case for them to be able to get those returns on investment, and also to be able to really look at ways that they can shift the conflict dynamics and paradigms in the places where they're operating, I think that can be really transformative for our field. And so that could look like opportunities where they are alongside local organizations, co-located with them. It could be sitting inside boardrooms of big international corporations. It could be sitting there trying to advise governments that are wrestling with whether or not they want to make these requirements for some of the big industries that may be coming in to invest. Also, it could go up in smoke. That's part of what makes all this stuff so interesting. But there's a couple of ideas and I think promising potential for the future that I hope that you'll be able to take the torch from us and take it forward.
Oh, Paul, very interesting. Thank you so much. We're going to open the floor up now to people who have a question or a comment or want to say something. Before we do that, let me just say two things. A couple of things. One is I want to congratulate the speakers for sticking to the time limit. That was a world's record. And I appreciate it very much, and so does everybody else. I also want to thank Amber Williams, who's here in the room, not face to face, but hiding behind a GM sign. Amber is responsible for doing really all the technology and setting all of this up, and getting us all prepared for it. And we very much appreciate it. She does terrific work. The last thing I wanted to say is that I think two things that you've heard so far from all of our speakers is that the field, there are potentials in the field for expansion that create new kinds of jobs, and jobs that aren't necessarily identified initially as certainly not as mediation, and sometimes not as conflict resolution at all. And it made me think of two things to mention. One, very quickly, we once upon a time at the Carter School had an institution called the Conflict Clinic, which Pete and Brian will remember very well, which was headed up by Jim Lowy. And one of the things that they would do is spot a situation which really called out for some kind of conflict resolution effort, and actually they would go and market themselves as conflict resolution specialists to people who had no prior interest in conflict resolution. Somebody who was really, two people who were wonderful at doing that. It was a guy named Frank Bleckman, and another one named Bill Potopchik. Frank is now retired and off in the Southwest. Bill is still in town and still doing his work. They would do things like, for example, discover that there were government processes, very often local or state government processes, which were not producing good results for people. They were generating conflict instead of resolving conflict, dragging out disputes over long periods of time, and in the end, the results were not satisfactory to anybody. So they really created a new field, a subfield themselves, which some people have called public dispute resolution, as opposed to alternative dispute resolution in general. And Bill Potomczyk developed methods of getting parties to conflicts together and doing task force work in situations, for example, where there's a road proposed to be built through a lot of communities. Nobody wants the road in their community. Bill developed procedural methods of getting the parties together and developing, after a while, consensus about where the road should go. And it proved to be invaluable, really, not only to the communities, but to the government agencies that were stalemated prior to that time. So one thing that we want to be thinking about is, well, what kinds of conflicts are out there that are not being resolved that we might be able to help resolve, even though that might involve kind of creating a new branch of the field to do it. Second thing I wanted to say is that comes from what Paul just said about institutions, and also Michael, that institutions that might or might not be considered to be involved in conflict management or conflict resolution, and that have not come to people like ours for guidance or for services, but who are out there and are possible customers. We have a kind of spectacular new illustration of that in connection with, in the Carter School, in connection with something that Melvin Hardy, who's in here today, knows about. Mel is on our advisory board. He's also a Rotarian. And we are, as many of you may know, in the process of cooking up a collaboration between the Carter School and Rotary International and Rotary clubs locally and across the country. Rotary is an organization, it's a fraternal, sororal organization with 1.5 million members around the world, 30,000 or so clubs around the world. Many people in that organization say that they're interested in peace. And a lot of them are interested in peace, but they have not been in contact with people in our profession to help them very much, to help them deal with specific problems, conflict problems, both internally and externally. You know, this war in Ukraine and Russia is going to end one of these days, please God. And when it does, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of Rotarians on both sides of that line of in Ukraine and in Russia, who can play a part in peace building at the end of that conflict. So thinking of that sort of situation, we are now working very hard on that. And we hope that you will also think, people interested in working in the field will think, well, what kinds of institutions are there out there that aren't being served by us right now, but that might be. So that's my little comment. And now I'm happy to hear from any of you who would like to speak. You can use the hand raising function if you want to. Okay, we have Jeff. Jeff Hazen for us.
Yes, thanks, Rich, and thanks everyone who's spoken. I'm actually one of those Rotarians who heard about the Carter School when I went to the annual convention that we have this past May. It was in Singapore, and I met Dean Ozerdom there, and I met Charles Davidson. Was impressed by both. So anyway, so I got on your mailing list. I'm 68, so and I'm thinking I've been in China for about 30 years. So I've been for the last 20. Executive coach and a facilitator focused on leadership. My question, and I'll keep it short because I suspect there's some other people on the call who are a little bit younger than I am and just getting into the field. And so your comments might apply more to them. But when I move back to the States in a year or two, I'm just wondering if there are any tips that you might offer me in terms of the peace building, conflict resolution, perhaps in the conflict prevention or the reconciliation spaces, where somebody of my age who doesn't have an official background in peace building might gain a little bit of leverage and might not ask for very much money to be involved.
Anybody on the panel like to answer that?
Well, can I suggest we take a few? I see a couple of hands, given that there might be some duplication, and I'd especially love to get to some folks if there are any.
Good idea. We'll hold that question. And we have Colonel Pratt. you want to say something?
Yes, thank you for putting this together, and to all the panelists for your insights. And my question is, what efforts have you seen, and what efforts would you advise to bring more diverse voices into this field? Because I know that when I was coming through the Carter School, I was not reading the work of people that looked like me. And so as I tried to talk to my children, the next generation, about joining this field, I find it difficult to encourage them when there's no one that looks like them. And, you know, I think of our indigenous neighbors, our Latino neighbors, our Arabic neighbors. There are so many voices that I just don't see represented. And as our global population becomes progressively more brown, this is a blind spot that needs to be addressed. So I'd love to hear any efforts you know that are underway, or some things that we can do to address this.
Very good, thank you. Very important question, and we'll get to it for sure. We have Randy. You have a hand up too, Randy Leos.
Yes, thanks. So I really resonated with a lot of what you folks had said in terms of the challenges within the field. My focus has been political polarization in the U.S. and worked for an organization that dealt with that. But a lot of the there is a very big funding challenge, and a lot of this work, especially facilitation, which is my primary focus, is done by volunteers. And so there's not necessarily the funding to pay folks who have developed a very distinct skill set with that. And so I'm certainly trying to follow some of the routes that you all have advocated in terms of working with corporations and other businesses. I'm actually doing a session tomorrow just about that as part of Peace Week. But a lot of them are a bit skittish in addressing polarization as an issue. They've seen some backlash there, and so my question is just about the most effective pathway into these organizations. How do they really want to engage? How are they reaching out to practitioners that can help them with these issues that are clearly causing some cultural challenges within their organizations?
Okay, thank you, Randy. Let's take one more question before we start having some responses. Mel Hardy has a hand up. I'd like to hear from you quickly, Mel.
Very briefly, I'm going to respond to Colonel Pratt's note. Bonnie Jenkins ran before she had to resign. She's Undersecretary for State at State for the Bureau of International Security, Non-Proliferation, and Disarmament. And she runs something called WCAPS, or Women Advancing Peace and Security, Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security. So I would engage with that. I have become, on their mailing list. I think it's important to have, as we talk about the DEI thing or the PII thing, or that we have to center pluralism in our field. So, and thank you, Rich, for this. This is fantastic.
All right, thank you, Mel. So you've had 3 questions and a comment. Well, are there some responses that anybody on the speakers list would like to make?
Rich, I can certainly give a couple.
Go ahead, Pete. Go ahead.
If you'd like.
Colonel
Pratt, to yours, my sense of, certainly in the federal space, is the issues you've raised are front and center with many, many agencies, and they're doing lots to promote dialogues, inclusion, and incorporate it into many different areas. And I would just echo the last comment that was made over about what's happening at State Department. I see this, I know it's certainly on our radar screen, that these issues of changing the changing nature of the work force and its makeup is certainly in this administration top of mind. I would go back. The second comment I would make is to the first question about trying to enter after you spent 30 years in China. I would give you two suggestions. There's lots of community groups that are out there, I think, or NGOs within the domestic space that are addressing issues that you may want to, that I'm certain would welcome people with your experience in coaching and facilitation to help work on their community problems. I think there's many organizations. You just need, as Brian said, to get networked into them. If you're interested in working in the international space, I would definitely try and sign up with some of the larger companies that are working in the developmental world, because you could be used as a subject matter expert by the Deloittes and by the Chemonics and by the Booz Allens, who are bidding on developmental projects, who could use short-term consultants with that kind of expertise. That's all I had, Rich.
Can I piggyback on Pete real quick?
Yes.
Okay, so when it comes, I look at baskets of people getting into the field, the brand news, that entry level, and typically they have less of, in terms of responsibilities, life responsibilities, children, mortgage, whatever, and they're free to run. And I say, while you're young, run. And then there's the middle career people who are enhancing their career or moving out, and then there's people who have great personal experience in institutional history, and it's priceless. You can actually, has so much going for you. You may not even realize it, but I echo everything that Pete says. I'd add the MITRE Corporation to that list of people looking for folks like you. You can take, it's not the skills that you have, it's the knowledge you have, it's the networks you have, play those up. And then when it comes to inclusion and diversity, things along those lines, many of the greatest leaders in our field are from diverse communities, in particular women, but I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with Marvin Johnson. He's been in the field for almost 40 years. He's presidentially appointed as an arbitrator. He runs a conference every single year for members of our community that are African American primarily, so hundreds of people wind up over by Goddard Space Flight Center, and he has a group called MOCA, Mediators of Color Alliance. And Marvin has a sense of humor, but literally he is super well connected. So when it comes to people who are generating new knowledge or people who are leading up in practice, there are some grandmothers and grandfathers of the field that you need to connect with, and you'll realize there's a ton going on. And then I finally say this, I'm not so interested in who people are, what they say and their ideas. And, you got King and Gandhi and Jesus, and they all said great things. They don't look anything like me. And then I'd say this, there's a guy named Arthur Brooks. You got to look him up to pursue Arthur Brooks. Look him up.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate, and Colonel, I appreciate your comment. All the members of this all-white male panel appreciate you're making that comment. But I need to also tell you, we can talk another time about it. There have been a lot of changes at the Carter School since your time. We had a student faculty working group working on, among other things, making sure that the curriculum itself is the product of diverse, creative people. Anyway, I can talk to you about the way we've been doing hires and other things. I think are responsive to your concerns. And I have to say, of course, that the field as a whole, it started out this started out a white male, white males dominating the field. After a while, females became, starting with Elise Boulding, who was with us for a couple of years, females became equally or more important than white males in the field and are today. But people of color took longer for us to attract people of color to the field, and I think partly that was because the civil rights movement was, in which a number of us were involved, was was so powerful and so fiery that I think a lot of people first, and in the early days, thought that conflict resolution meant getting everybody to lower their voice and shut up and not rock the boat too much and compromise about everything. So it took a while, I think, for the field itself, as well as for people outside the field to understand that's not what conflict resolution is about. Right? It's about solving the problems that create conflict, including systemic problems, not about getting people to talk more quietly or be even to be nicer to one another. So anyway, there's a lot for us to talk about later. Paul, you have a
Sure, just a couple of quick thoughts. One is I think that, you know, in terms of what are the opportunities to engage around political polarization, and particularly it sounded like you were interested in the corporate realm. I think when after a crisis hits and settles down before it becomes ancient memory, is a point of reflection and contemplation in a lot of organizations, and that might be worth, you know, trying to look at what's going on in the world or in your community and seeing what opportunities might surface with regards to kind of issues of inclusion and diversification. I spent about a decade in the State Department, and it was an incredibly white male dominated entity. Then they have been trying to change. There's some good programs that are there, but I think it's a generation or two before it starts to really reflect what America looks like. However, if I reflect on just the other week when I was over at the Carter School at PeaceCon, you know, the panels that I sat on with practitioners, I was the only male. And there were representatives from a number of different backgrounds. I often find myself in meetings where if there are males, there aren't very many. And I do think that there's an issue that frankly we're uncomfortable talking about, which is how do we create entry points into a field that doesn't necessarily generate real high levels of income, especially at the entry and mid-level points. When people are coming from poverty or coming from constrained financial backgrounds and economic backgrounds, because I think there are real disincentives for people to go and look at, you know, how do we take a free internship and how do we take a salary for the first 5, 8, 10 years that really often is below poverty level. And that's not a conversation that I hear taking place in the field. But there are groups that are reflecting kind of the diversity of and within the field. A couple have been mentioned. There's another one that just to throw another one out there, and I know there's lots more. But the women in international security is a big one that started probably 10 or 15 years ago, and now it's a huge player. With I think several thousand women in the DC area that are in lots of different aspects of conflict and security and engaged there. And then the last part is just a quick reflection, like as an executive coach, you know, those training skills, facilitation skills, and probably strategy development that you have, I think would be incredibly valuable. There are companies that and nonprofits that do that exclusively, where you can help, you know, develop develop individuals, develop organizations, develop partners, etc., in ways that I'm sure you would find rewarding, and they would be incredibly grateful to have the depth of your experience when you come back.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Other people on the committee, anybody want to answer Jeff's question? Jeff's coming back to town and wants to know if you're interested in peace and conflict resolution. How do you get involved? Any answers to that question? Jeff, my answer is come over to Carter School. We'll have coffee. Call me. I'm serious. Email me, and we'll set something up. I think there are a lot of activities going on there that you may be interested in, and also there are connections that we have that you may be interested in also. But I'm glad you're interested in the field.
Hey,
Paul,
Rich.
We only have a
Rick-
couple minutes left, so let me make sure people who have something to say get to say it.
Hey, Rich.
Yeah, Pete.
I wanted to go to Randy's comment. Randy, you were talking about getting into some of the organizations. I think a critical piece of this is how you get the conversations even started in the organizations that you were thinking about in the first place, because it's getting the conversation started and naming the issue provides the entree to do it and the safety to do it, hopefully. And I think that's the first hurdle. So I think that's the thing you want to focus on. That's just my instinct or my experience in those areas.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I think, if we had another hour or two to talk about this, one thing that I would want to get us talking about is Paul's comment, which he started with, about funding issues in the field, funding problems in the field, and which is the context in which he offered that comment was really a context in which conflict seems to be worse in lots of ways, in lots of places, in lots of ways now than it has been for some time. At this moment, we're all holding our breaths about Lebanon and Israel, and other conflicts around the world, including some that are more or less invisible, but in some ways even worse, like Sudan. And with that kind of with that sort of thing going on, the stock of peace, in peace and conflict studies tends to decline. I've talked to people all the time where I tell them I'm in conflict resolution, and I can see them thinking, should I tell this guy I don't think he's doing a very good job? Right? With things really in such bad shape in so many places, it's now on us. It becomes our responsibility kind of to explain why we haven't resolved all these conflicts, why, in fact, they're so difficult to resolve, and how we still have hope that they can be resolved, and what we're planning to do. That we maybe have not made the case for our field very well especially when it comes to dealing with these so-called intractable conflicts, and especially in an atmosphere in which people are so nervous, and people are terrifically anxious about. They're anxious about the election in the United States. They're anxious about what happens next in Ukraine. All right. So, how do we deal with that? I think that's a real challenge to our field and one that I think we're all trying to meet it in different ways, and it's not easy to meet. But I think facing it helps, right? I think it helps to recognize that there are kinds of conflicts that we have not been very good at resolving, but then to talk about what we think is going to take to resolve them. Yes, who's got a hand up? I don't see it, but whoever you are, go ahead and speak.
I do. Can I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I had a question about what Michael was saying about peace building issues sort of taking a turn towards climate change and peace building. So I'm actually wondering about these things and how they're so like funder oriented. Like it's everything is basically very funder driven. Like a while ago, there was a much bigger focus on, say, women's rights and girl child's education, but now it's shifting towards climate change and related issues. Do you have any predictions on what the future trends might look like? Because I'm gonna finish my PhD in maybe 4 years, hopefully. So I want to know if you have any thoughts on that.
Okay, thank you, Prerna. We're officially
we're
out
at time.
of-
Yeah, let me just quickly respond to that, and also to Colonel Pratt's comment about representation, because I think what Carter could benefit from is a de-siloing practice too, so that we're more embedded in other departments. And I know we're headed in that direction. I mean, the fact that we have a political leadership academy shows a prioritization at Carter of getting our conflict practitioners in policy spaces, in political spaces. But similarly, with all the other conflicts that continue to emerge or reemerge, whether they're climate focused, economic focused, racial focused, gender, you name it, how do we do a better job with either our certificate programs or centers that we're building out at Carter? Granted, I'm not full-time at Carter, so it's easy for me to say from the outside, not the inside. I get that these take resources, but I see a conflict community of the future being much less siloed in this kind of traditional camp of conflict thinkers, and much more de-siloed. And whether we're embedding in these different departments across Mason, or we're building out certificate programs that are working with those leading DEI efforts in my cities, for example, because when I think of the folks leading the DEI efforts in my cities, they're not coming from conflict camps, but they're sometimes using similar language and similar processes and methodologies, et cetera, but they're coming from different departments. They schooled at different schools, and that's a missed opportunity for us to be in conversation with them, coordination with them, collaboration with them. And so in terms of predicting 4 years out, I mean, any of the conflicts that we've discussed today will still be with us, and probably worse, politically, environmentally, race, gender, economics, et cetera. So I think it is the onus is on the Carter School to get out of these old camps that were, as Rich noted, white male led in the early phases in terms of the programming, not obviously the practitioner work on the ground. That was much more representative of the world. But I think in that de-siloing process, we'll be more representative, and we'll have better collaborations and a better product too. So that's the opportunity. I get that takes resources. But I and many others are always, including Rich, are prodding Carter in that direction. Happy to chat offline, because I know we're at time, but happy to chat offline about your
Michael, thank
more
you
specific PhD
so much,
program.
and thank you so much. And let me thank all of you for being here, for attending. I hope it was interesting for you. All of us are happy to talk to you further. Just email us or contact us. Brian Polkinghorn is at Salisbury. Peter Swanson is at FMCS. Michael Shank is here in town, and Paul Turner and the Fund for Peace are also in town. And it's been great talking to you, and I wish you the best. Good luck, and good luck in the field. Take care. All right.